To revitalize the dairy industry is back online, and Dr. Wolf is back with us. Dr. Wolf.
Thanks. This one. Sorry. Y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks. Appreciate it. So, let's see. We have about an hour left. Okay, so I'm going to finish up talking about how prices are defined in the orders, and then I'll go through an example for a Vermont farm, and then we can talk about the state one. Some of the slides I have in here, I'm going to kind of skip over as we go, and I think you all have access to the slide deck, and so you can take a look at them if you want, but some of them have a lot of detail on the class prices that I don't think we need to get into this morning. So you may have noticed, or you probably know this already, that milk prices in this country are priced on 100 weights. That's what I'm going to be throwing around when I do the numbers here, which is simply means 100 pounds of milk, which you all know about. When I go to other countries, then they want to know, what does that mean? It's 11.63 gallons. And every place else in the world, we would be talking about kilograms or liters, but it's the metric system, and they can't make us use it apparently because we're not going to. So component prices are priced per pound, rounded to the nearest 100th cent. We use cheese. We use wholesale prices for cheese, both blocks, 40-pound blocks and 500-pound barrels, for dry whey, butter, and non-fat dry milk, which the USDA surveys weekly. And every producer that produces a million pounds or more of those products has to report, they're required to report their quantities and the prices that they are, wholesale prices that they have. Class 1 and 2 prices come out in advanced, and actually it's half of the class 2 price and all of the class 1 price. And the class 3 and 4 are announced after the fact. So they get applied retroactively, and the way it works when the farmers actually get paid is they get paid an estimated price at the middle of the month or so, and then later on they get a settlement that kind of works it all out one way or another. So class 1 prices then are things that you drink. So bottled milk, buttermilk, eggnog. Class 2 prices are things that you eat with a spoon, which is ice cream, it's yogurt. Class 3 is cheese and cream cheese, and class 4 is butter, non-fat dry milk. Class 3 is also whey products, because whey is a joint product. When you make cheese, right, you get whey, and we're going to price it based on a minimum price based on dry whey. But actually anymore, there are lots of other products that get made. We have kind of, we do whey protein isolates and whey protein concentrates now. There's a big new cheese plant that went into operation a couple years ago now in Michigan. When I say big, I mean 7 pounds of milk, 7 million pounds of milk a day, so 700,000 pounds of cheese. It's a pretty big plant, and I can tell you that they also are making whey protein concentrates and isolates, and they're making at least as much money off of the whey as they are off the cheese in that operation, because they're making special proteins for different uses. And then butter and non-fat dry milk is class 4. So we can get it, and then there's a lot more than I just said, right? So there's other things: cultured milk, flavored milk, it's all class 1, and class 2 is all the desserts and cottage cheese and things of that nature. And then if you go through 1 through 4, then you'll see, if you look at the Federal Milk Marketing Order websites, there's also lowest use class, which means that milk that was effectively dumped. There's always a little bit of milk dumped because plants go down because of maybe a weather event or a power outage, or some weather event causes trucks to time out, or something happens. There's an accident somewhere. So on average, it's about 0.3% of milk across the federal orders gets dumped in any given month. And that gets assigned to the lowest class price if it's pooled. Okay, so it's not a complete loss as long as you meet the qualifying and reporting standards. in the Northeast and the Mideast orders in the last 5 years, there's been more milk that's been dumped just because of lack of balancing capacity in some cases. And so there's actually been some bigger numbers than that 0.3% in the Northeast in some months, especially during the spring flush. And that kind of reflects the kind of bigger conversation that's been going on in the region about encouraging new investment in balancing capacity. And in the last 2 years since we've had the pandemic, there's also been challenges with just having enough workers, even if you've got the plant capacity, if you can't find people to operate it, then this is a problem, right? So that's been part of the challenging, and that's led to things like the co-op base excess programs that affect maybe 50% of the milk production in the country, but have been particularly common in the Northeast part of the country. That's kind of getting off track though, so sorry. As I mentioned earlier, the Florida, the Southeast Appalachian, and Arizona have milk fat adjusted price only. And that's also typical of the orders that exist primarily because the class 1 use is high. And those orders all have high class 1 utilization, as I'll show you. Multiple component pricing only is the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, and California. It's also the Western New York State order, which operates just like the Northeast, but West. And then multiple component pricing with a quality adjustment is for basically the orders that are really heavily cheese. So the upper Midwest in particular, and the Western, which was terminated in 2004. And what that bottom category means is that you've got a somatic cell adjuster. Somatic cells are foreign cells that are in milk, and the cheese yield drops off steeply as somatic cell count comes up. So what happens in those orders on the bottom is that the federal order defines a somatic cell adjustment. And if you get paid more if you sell milk that's below 350,000 on the somatic cell count, and you get paid less if you're above that. And also co-ops and cheese processors will have their own adjustments above and beyond the federal milk marketing order adjustments in that case, because they're trying to encourage higher quality milk. And if you look at over time what milk producers have done, the butter fat has gone up, the protein content has gone up because they're getting paid more based on protein and fat content, and the somatic cell count, which is a measure, if you will, in some sense of the cleanliness of the milk and the milking procedures has definitely gone down over time in response to this.
And Chris, on
yes,
the somatic cell count, have you ever looked at the different productivity of or pounds of cheese or butter you can get out of milk that has a very low somatic cell count compared to the 350,000?
I have only read the research and seen the statistical relationship that they've defined between the two. So I've never done, there are publications in food science where they look at milk quality and cheese yield, for example. And that's where that came from.
You don't have anything to tell us what the difference is in the output, right?
No, but I could get you something if it would be useful.
Well, we certainly appreciate the farmers putting out a very high quality product here in the Northeast, and if you can manufacture a pound or two of cheese more per hundredweight, it should be worth more. And
absolutely right. No, that's a good point. And this somatic cell adjuster that I'm talking about, that is not in the Northeast but is in the like Mideast and upper Midwest, that's in some sense also a minimum adjustment. The co-ops and processors are allowed to do their own quality premiums on top of that. And I don't know, but it is a good question how the quality premiums in the Northeast are, how big they are and how they are similar or not similar to ones in like the upper Midwest would be an interesting question. Because you're right. If you're selling milk that's 150,000 somatic cell, you're going to get a lot more cheese out of that milk than if it's 350,000, right? So you should get rewarded for that. Absolutely.
Class 3 is the highest class.
And Representative O'Brien, did you have a question that?
I did. I'm just wondering how, I mean, it seems like a lot of these, the orders and the pricing that goes with it is somewhat based on a vacuum, or it's done, on a sort of wholesale level. And so I'm wondering, like, what happens with market share penetration if Kerry Gold all of a sudden, gets a much bigger share of the market, or plant-based beverages do? How do the federal orders respond to that?
Well, that's a good question. To the extent that you had more imports coming in, right? Then, everything else equal, we might expect that means that the wholesale prices are lower. And so it's going to feed back through that way. What has effectively happened in this country is we used to have something called the price support program, which I'm not talking about because it doesn't exist anymore. But from 1949, when it was created, until we did it, well, officially it was done away with in the 2014 Farm Bill. But in a practical sense, the price support program mostly stopped influencing milk prices by about the mid-90s on a regular basis. And so what we used to do is we used to have a price floor, which is different than what I'm talking about here, which said the government will buy as much cheese, butter, non-fat dry milk as you want to sell to them at this price. And the intention was then that you could then pay farmers, a reasonable price based on what you could. So it was an open offer to purchase. It was a put option, if you will, if we're thinking about futures and options. So for example, the price support in 1982 was $13.10 a hundredweight. And that maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot to you now, but if we were to convert it to today's dollars, it would be about $40 a hundredweight. So, whereas today we're looking at $25 and thinking, that's a pretty high price for the most part, right? So that was really high back then. And it was because we had the price support tied to parity, which was the period from 1910 to 1914, which is a lot of things that we did in the Great Depression came out looking like that. Anyway, as part of the kind of budget process, and because it got really expensive, we ratcheted down that price support until it didn't interfere with market prices anymore. And that brought with it price volatility. So if you look at farm milk price, it's kind of just has a little bit of seasonality until we get about to 95, 96. And then all of a sudden you start seeing some real volatility, which is why we have the need for price risk management at the farm level at this point in time. But we don't do that anymore. So, and because we have kind of stayed out of that, our wholesale prices are competitive with world prices, which is why we now export about 18% of milk production, milk solids, although more protein than fat. We consume most of the fat here and we export the excess protein that we don't need, mostly in the form of non-fat dry milk, dry whey protein concentrates and isolates, and we also lactose. We sell a lot of lactose to China, for example. But for the most part, we're competitive on product prices at the world level. So our wholesale prices, for the most part, are also kind of depending on supply and demand. And that's kind of those effects that you were asking about, Representative O'Brien, work their way kind of through the wholesale prices in this case. Okay, so.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
So let me just talk about how they actually determine these class prices. So USDA surveys the wholesale commodity prices weekly that we talked about. Then they compute a weighted average price weekly. And then from that, they can compute a monthly based on the prices and the sales volume that these manufacturers are reporting to them for the wholesale product prices. Then we compute the component prices using product price formulas that work as follows. The commodity price, so let's say butter, minus, but since we're starting with the finished product, we have to allow for the fact that it costs something to manufacture it, which is what we call a make allowance. So we start with the butter price minus the amount that we're allowing for the butter, churning and packaging to happen, times a yield factor, which would be how many pounds of butter do we get out of a pound of butter fat. And so, for example, when we make butter in this country, it's 80% fat, which is a little weird because the rest of the world makes 82% fat butter. But again, we got to do it our way, apparently. So the yield factor is 1.21. So 1 pound of butter fat makes 1.2 pounds of butter because it's 80% fat. So, and the result then is the component price. So we take, if butter sells for $3, if the make allowance is 20 cents, then you've got $3 minus 20 cents, which is 280. And by the way, that's not the make allowance. I can't remember what it is right now. Times the 1.2 yield factor gives you the component price of butter. Okay. So the commodity prices from the surveys, those change monthly. The make allowance is the cost to manufacture the product. The yield factor is the pounds of component to make the product. The make allowance and the yield factors do not change regularly. They only change through hearings. We haven't changed the make allowances in the federal milk marketing order since 2009. Okay, that's part of the dissatisfaction right now with the federal milk marketing orders is the processors are saying, geez, you know what, the energy prices are a whole heck of a lot different than they were in 2009. Maybe we should, think about changing this. In California, by the way, when they had their state order, changed it much more frequently than that. And one of the things you're going to see discussed in the federal milk marketing order discussion is, why don't we do it the way California did and change those make allowances periodically based on manufacturing costs? But the other thing to remember about that and why that's not just an obvious slam dunk is if make allowance goes up, everything else equal, farm price goes down.
Chris,
Yeah.
I think you need 1 minute on what the make allowance is.
Yeah. Well, again, the make allowance is the manufacturing cost. So, it depends. So what should it be? Well, we have a distribution of manufacturing costs. So the small cheese plants are going to have a different manufacturing cost than are the really big cheese plants that are coming online now. So when we set that make allowance, where should it be set is part of the discussion. Mark Stevenson from the University of Wisconsin, who spent many years here at Cornell, just finished a study where he surveyed a whole bunch of different plants, and you can look at what his estimates of the make allowance are. And the short story is he says they're 20% higher than they were in 2009, and so they should be higher if we're going to reflect that, because costs have gone up to manufacture, just with inflation.
But the point is what you said before. If it's 20 cents, the manufacturer gets that comes out off the top, so the price to the farmer is reduced by
That's
the
right. Right. So if we were to do what Mark's study says and increase that by 20%, and it was 24 cents now instead of 20, then the component price to the farmer, which is the end of this equation here, is going to be lower. Right. So it's and by the way, that also means if you're a really, let's say, big manufacturer with a low cost of production, you have a built-in margin there. And so to the extent that you can be below that make allowance, you're better off like automatically. And if you're above that make allowance, and so a lot of, for example, smaller cheese manufacturers that use older facilities and stuff might be at a disadvantage there. Is that getting at what you wanted to, Dan?
Yeah.
So then we determine we start with the products, we tear them apart into the component prices, which are really butter, fat, and protein for the most part. Then we take those component prices and put them back together to define the class prices to be the farmers. Okay. And so the class prices are found by plugging the component values into the federal pricing formulas. This is a slide from the USDA. Some of the formulas use advanced prices like class 1 and 2, and some of them use the after the fact prices. So we start with the commodities, which are the wholesale prices of cheese, butter, dry whey, non-fat dry milk. We get the component prices, which are protein, butter, fat, other solids, and non-fat. So for example, and the class 1 gets priced on the advanced, which I'll explain what that means in a minute. So they know the price ahead of the month that we're talking about, and classes 3 and 4 get priced after the fact, but there's a settlement in there. So you get an advance estimate of a price and then they settle it. And so by the 23rd of the preceding month, we get the class 1 price. So the HB Hoods and Deans and Walmarts of the world that are processing their own milk, and Kroger, for example, knows what the class 1 price is going to be. And if you talk to the retailers, by the way, they will tell you that they need this information so that they can figure out things like whether they're going to do promotions. Okay, they will also, we make the class 1 processors participate in this. They don't have a choice. And then kind of in return, we tell them what their prices are going to be ahead of time. And we do that based on the first 2 weeks of the month before. So if we're talking about September class 1 prices, those were based on those national surveys that were done the first 2 weeks of August and then are announced by the 23rd of August. And I don't remember which day exactly it was. I have a calendar. Well, I do. I did because it's probably announced on the 19th, given that's a Friday. So class 1 prices are announced, skim and butterfat. Class 2 skim prices announced ahead of time, but not the butterfat. That's announced afterwards. And class 1 prices then are adjusted based on the county that the receiving plant is located in. Then by the 5th of the following month, so September prices for class 1 were known by the 19th of August, but we won't know September prices until October. Yeah, the end of the first week of October. We'll then know the class 2 butterfat, so class 2, class 3 price, and class 4 prices. So those happen after the fact. So there's a lag between when the class 1 price is announced and when the class 3 and 4 prices are announced. And that leads to some strange dynamics in the milk marketing orders. And I'm going to just skip these prices, but actually, let me just talk this one briefly. So the class 4 price then is the class 4 skim milk price. So what's skim milk worth times 0.965 plus the butterfat price times 3.5. All of the class prices are announced standardized to 3.5% butterfat. Okay, so that's why class 4 prices, whatever the price of butterfat is, times 3.5, because we assume there's 3.5 pounds of butterfat in 100 pounds of milk, plus the remaining 96.5 are skim. Okay, so these are good for reference, but farmers actually get paid based on pounds of butterfat and pounds of protein and pounds of non-fat solids. So it just, and where do we get these prices from? Well, the non-fat solids price is the non-fat dry milk price from the AMS surveys at the wholesale level, minus 16.78 cents, which is the make allowance. So that's the manufacturing cost times 0.99. And the butterfat price is the butter price, again, from AMS surveys, minus the 17.15, which is the make allowance. So if I'm a butter manufacturer and my cost is less than that, then I've got a better margin right there. I mean, if my cost is more than that, then I'm worse off. And I'm just gonna, sorry about this, I'm just gonna skip these slides because we just go through each one of them with the makes and we don't have time. So the producer price then, what producers actually get paid is the uniform or blend price, which is the weighted average price. So look at how much milk in the Northeast went into classes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Multiply those percentages times the class prices for any given month, and you get a statistical uniform price. So a weighted average or blend price. The class 1 prices vary depending based on the location of the plant, and those are defined at the county level, and I'll show you a map of that in a moment. And the classes 2, 3, and 4 are national. Okay, so those apply across the United States. And again, you can receive more than that. There are cheese plants that get premiums, that pay premiums above that. There are co-ops that have contracts with cheese plants, and the contract might say, we're going to pay you class 3 plus 15 cents. So those absolutely happen. And then in orders that require payment adjusted for milk quality, which is not the Northeast, the somatic cell adjustment is the cheese price times that decimal, which is what, 0.0005, which is 350,000 somatic cell plus or minus 1,000. So again, back to what Senator Starr asked about earlier, for those orders, if it's a higher cheese price, they're going to get a better somatic cell discount than if it's a lower cheese price. So right now, cheese price is what, $1.80-ish? So, if it goes to $2, then the somatic cell adjustment rate is going to go up to the extent that you have a somatic cell below 350, and it's going to penalize you if you get above 350.
So, Chris, so farmers do get paid then for having a lower somatic cell count?
Not in the Northeast. So in the Mideast, in California, the upper Midwest, the Mideast, Central, and the Pacific Northwest, but not in the Mideast, not in the Northeast. And I don't remember the other two. So, but that doesn't mean, by the way, that your co-op or processor can't be paying you that. It just means it's not done through the Federal Milk Marketing Order. Does that make sense?
Well, no, not really. But it doesn't make sense to have it done that way. Because if you look at, I only know about Vermont, but our somatic cell count it runs low constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have a very high quality product that our farmers are producing. And, it would seem to me that would be an advantage to manufacturing companies to buy that higher quality, and it should the farmers should certainly be getting paid for that high quality product. But we'll deal with that moving forward.
I agree with you, Senator Starr, and so let me be careful. Agrimark and DFA and others may and probably do have their own. I'm just not familiar with what it is off the top of my head. So, for example, in Michigan, where I spent many years, the Mideast order has this somatic cell adjustment rate, but Michigan Milk Producers Co-op also had their own add-on. Okay, so there's nothing that precludes Agrimark and Dairy Farmers of America and others in the Northeast from having their own quality program. It's just not done in the Northeast through the order. So.
Well, we'll check that out.
Okay, it's a good question. So the class 1 prices essentially vary based on how far you are from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is, if you're not familiar with Wisconsin, which is right up here, if you can see my cursor, in kind of Northwest, what I in particular consider Northwest Wisconsin, because I'm from very south part of Wisconsin. But when they started this, the class structure for the Federal Milk Marketing Orders, and they wanted again to design an incentive for fluid milk to move to places that were deficit in fluid milk. And at that point in time, particularly when the first studies were done, Wisconsin was very much a big surplus, and still is a big surplus region of milk. And so they thought, well, milk can always flow from there. And so let's get it moving. So as you can't really see, whoops, I'm sorry. So this says $1.70 here in Wisconsin as a class 1 differential. So what we would do is build the class 1 price based on the value of butterfat and skim milk and get a number, let's say $18 a hundredweight. And then, if the plant were in this location, we would add another $1.70. Okay. And then if you get all the way down here, I'm sorry, I copied this one, it just didn't copy well. You get all the way down here to South Florida, and it's like $5 or something. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's in that neighborhood. And so the class 1 price was, would be $19.70 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and $23 in Miami. Okay. And so it was to encourage milk to flow. And so you kind of have these price surfaces that they estimated, and they're defined at the county level in these different bands here. So all of these green ones are the same price surface. And then it gets wonky when you get out here in California, though, because California is kind of an island unto itself. That is a big surplus. And so once you get to the Rocky Mountains, it's not just as simple. How far are you from Wisconsin? In fact, the California numbers are basically the same as the Wisconsin ones. So if we look at the Northeast, then you get, this is from the Northeast Milk Marketing Order. And this is what the class 1 differentials are by location of the receiving plant. And so they kind of are highest in like Boston, out here in Eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that's 325. And then you kind of get up here to Vermont and you've got 280, 260, 250, 240. So it's a little bit, it's to encourage milk to flow, in this case, like towards Boston. And you can see what the differential is, 325 in Boston. And then you get down here to Vermont and it's defined, Burlington, it's 250. And so the milk is kind of encouraged in that sense to meet those fluid needs, because again, the incentive of this whole federal milk marketing orders was to kind of send milk towards where it's needed for fluids. And this is just a bigger picture of what I had up there before for the counties. And this is also a bigger picture where you can kind of see maybe the individual counties a little bit better. And so it gets, it gets smaller as you go this direction. And then you come down here and you're back into 320 and, Virginia and stuff. Because again, the milk is heading in that direction, is the intention from the surplus areas. So Vermont's, and you guys will have to tell me, I'm sure Dan knows off the top of his head. These are the pool handler plants that I found in the June 2022 Northeast order report. So a couple from Agrimark and then St. Albans and a few other ones. So it was like 7 plants, pool handler plants in Vermont. And you can kind of see this was the locations of the plants. And so this all comes from the Northeast Federal Milk Marketing Order reports, and so you can go on there and they will tell you monthly what milk is coming from where and which plants are pool plants and which plants are not, and so they define the plants based on the ones that have to be regulated versus the ones that choose to be regulated, and so if you could again be a cheese plant to be in here, but you wouldn't necessarily be if you didn't want to be. So then pooling is just calculating the weighted average, as I said. And part of the idea here of blending all of these prices across different uses and not like having a race to the bottom where we compete for these fluid contracts, which are more valuable, is also to recognize that the farms that are sending milk to cheese plants and butter plants and who's operating those cheese plants and butter plants are benefiting the entire market by what's called balancing, right? Because again, we have counter seasonal supply and demand. We have lots of variation from weekday to weekend. And so sharing those class 1 revenues across everybody is in some sense also recognizing that there needs to be compensation for balancing. So, and in addition to these minimum prices, cooperatives and groups of cooperatives can also negotiate overorder premiums. They can have voluntary overorder premium agreements. One thing, and I'm not going to talk much about that today unless somebody wants to, but one thing that you will notice over time, if you look at the overorder premiums that get reported by USDA, is that they're less common than they used to be, and they are lower than they used to be. Because it's been more difficult for the co-ops to negotiate and hold these voluntary overorder premium agreements. And that's part of the motivation to have state policy, is that it's been difficult to hold those voluntary agreements together. So then to kind of summarize, the key characteristics of the farm prices are that they're the minimum prices. Okay, they're not, you can pay more than that, you just can't pay less. That they're component based. Okay, so you get paid more for higher fat content, you get paid more for protein, and they may be adjusted for quality. That they're derived from the weighted average of class prices nationally, as far as the prices themselves are from national markets, that they're location adjustments for, in particular, class 1. And that processors must pay their suppliers at least the minimum price, but co-ops are not required to, although it doesn't make sense to persistently underpay. The blend prices then, as opposed to the class, or the blend prices then are the minimums that the handlers must pay to their suppliers, whether it's an individual farmer or a co-op. And those again are the bottom. Market sets the top. They're the weighted average of the class prices with some small adjustments. If you just go into the Federal Milk Marketing Order report and you say, 26% times the class 1 price plus 20% times class 2, and you do it all, you're actually not going to get the exact uniform price because there are some other adjustments that I'm not getting into. But you'd be reasonably close. They're component based. There's a partial payment that's paid to farmers in advance, the beginning of to the middle of the month, and a final payment, later because it takes time to calculate this. And then the plant prices are, again, the minimum. They're component based. The values are derived from the wholesale product prices. Some of these regulated prices include a premium. The rest are designed to clear a market. So again, the class 1 prices are designed to include a premium. The rest are designed to clear the market. And there's some timing based on whether you're get advance price notice, so you know a couple weeks before the month starts, or you find out just after the month ends. This is the utilization for 2020, which is the last year that the USDA put out the big report. I will dig up the 2021 ones here when they come out. But so the Northeast is the top line. I should have put 2019 up here, and so I apologize for that. And the reason I should have put 2019 up was 2020 was the first year of the pandemic, and things were weird in 2020. So class 1 utilization in the Northeast in 2020 was 30.6%. Class 2 was 24, class 3 was about 26, and class 4 was about 20. So this is fluid milk, yogurt, ice cream, cottage cheese, cheese, and butter. Couple things that I think stand out when you look at this. One is, well, there were higher class 1 utilizations, in particular down here in Appalachia and Southeast Florida, because these are the Southeast part of the United States, and those are primary class 1 markets, and those are the ones that pay just on butterfat. You can see that they have very little kind of balancing capacity. There's not much cheese there. There's not much butter for the most part. The other thing is the upper Midwest is primarily a cheese market, about 70% cheese. These are a little wonky though, because during the pandemic, a lot of cheese plants depooled their milk, which means they chose not to participate in the market. And the reason they did that is that instead of taking a draw from the milk in the middle of 2020, they would have been paying into the market. So they took their revenues and went home. And so that's why, for example, California here is just so weird, because normally class 3 would be a pretty big number for California, and instead it was pretty much class 4, but that's because a lot of milk was depooled. So
But it's changed a lot since then.
So depooling then is when, actually class 2, 3, or 4 processors can choose to participate in the pool or not. So they could depool. They could say, and so what happened in the middle of 2020 was that cheese prices got really high.
Down 4%, 5%.
And because of that lag between when class 1 prices are determined in particular and class 3 prices, and also because of a weird change they made in 2018 to the way class 1 prices are determined, which is that they're the average of classes 3 and 4 plus 74 cents instead of the higher of. What happened was that class 3 prices became the highest prices by far. So that cheese processors, instead of taking an equalization payment from the pool, would have been paying several dollars per hundredweight into the pool that would have been being shared across everybody. So particularly in the Southwest and California, and to a lesser extent in the upper Midwest, and to a little bit in the Northeast, a lot of the class 3 processors said, no, we're not going to pool this milk. We're gonna stay out of the pool this month. And what that allowed them to do was to pay the farmers what they would have been getting from the order anyway, or maybe even a little bit more, but then to pocket a big difference. And the reason that less depooling happened in the Northeast than those other orders is that there are stricter pooling standards in the Northeast order. And the biggest one is if you depool milk, then you have to requalify that milk back onto the order. And in the Northeast order, if you depool milk, you can only put 15% of what you depooled on each month. So it takes you more than 6 months to get that milk requalified. If you're in the California order, you can requalify it much faster than that. It takes about 2 months to get it requalified. So what happens then is in California, milk depools and then repools, and it contributes to volatility and uncertainty. And we don't see that nearly as much in the Northeast order. And one of the things that will probably get discussed when we do the federal milk marketing order kind of reform discussion is whether the other orders should have stricter pooling standards. So the other thing to consider about these milk marketing orders, and we've touched on some of this because you guys had some really good questions, is we've had declining class 1 utilization. So there's less money to share from that class 1 utilization. There's also important questions about whether the elasticity of demand has changed over time and what that means for the milk marketing orders. There's been increasing component levels and tests. Farmers have definitely responded to the multiple component pricing incentives. And then there's been balancing issues in some regions, and the Northeast is one of those regions where we've seen a significant amount of milk dumped in some months because there hasn't been a place to set a home for it as far as a manufacturing capacity. And so those are all important parts of the discussions we talk about that. So do the federal milk marketing order still make sense today? You guys have already kind of asked these questions, been really good questions. The rationale for classified pricing and pooling is not as strong as it used to be. The amount of money that's on the table has shrunk because of class 1 utilizations in particular have shrunk. The opportunity to exploit those demand elasticity differences has probably gotten smaller also. And then competition just at the retail level for food, just for people's stomachs and for the food categories has meant that the price of milk matters more to consumers than it used to. In particular, what have these beverages that are plant-based done to that, and then this whole discussions that all go around that as far as people's perceptions about environmental issues, labor issues, and just even quality issues are an important part of this. And then we have kind of national markets, not for fluid milk nearly as much, although even to some extent it's much bigger than it used to be. There's lots more milk flowing further, but definitely national markets for the other products. And so are we regionally like cooperating the way we need to there? Any questions on that? All right, so let me just talk briefly. So this is the Northeast marketing area statistics from July of 2022. You can see in this case, the percentage of class 1 milk is down from what it was in this average that I put up here, which was 31%. And partly that's because depooling was driving class 1 to higher percentages there. So, but for this month, which is the most recent one that's on the market administrator's website, about 27% class 1, you can see that's 616 million pounds that month. Class 2, 24%, 556 million pounds. Class 3 of about 30%, 687 million pounds. And class 4 of about 19%. I would say that right now, as far as kind of balance across the classes, the Northeast order is the kind of the most well-balanced one. As far as, if we were to do this for the upper Midwest, it would be, 80% class 3. And if we were to do it for California and all the milk was pooled, it would be basically mostly class 3 and 4. And then you can see the minimum class prices that were defined for that month. The class 1 base price is $29.12. And that would be the Boston price. The class 2 price is $26.66. Class 3, $22.52, and class 4, $25.79. So we do have a situation here where class 1 was the highest price. Class 3 in this case is the lowest price, and that reflects the discussion that we had earlier with the demand for butterfat and cream right now being so high, which is reflected in that relatively high class 4 price. The class 2 price, by the way, is built directly off of the class 4 price. So when we have a high class 4 price, we're going to have a high class 2 price. And those came from these minimum class prices were built from these component prices right down here. So butterfat was $3.36 for the month. Now that's not the price of butter. The price of butter was more like $3, $2.95. But remember, the butterfat, that's the component price. The protein price is $2.91, which is mostly built off of the cheese price. Other solids price of 36 cents a pound, and non-fat solids of $1.62 a pound. This, if we weight these prices, you won't get exactly this price, but the statistical uniform price at 3.5% butterfat was $26.36. If we adjust it for the fact that actually that Northeast producers in July shipped milk that was 3.9% fat and 3.06% protein, 5.8% other solids, we get an average statistical blend price that has to be paid to all the producers of $27.89. Okay, so that's what the average producer is going to receive. That's then going to be adjusted for some farm specific protein, fat numbers, and hauling costs and some deductions relative to the co-op. Then if we look at what the differentials were for that month, we adjust based on the location. So Middlebury, Vermont, $2.60, so 65 cents less than that $3.25 that the Boston was defined for. And that gives a lower statistical uniform price of $25.71.
Chris, could we go back one slide?
Yes, sir.
That one?
Yeah.
Early on in your presentation, you talked a little bit about an RO system and what was left once you took out that water.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you talked about protein price, the butterfat price. So my question is, if you ran milk through an RO like you do sat and get maple syrup, if you ran milk through an RO at the farm, what would that price break out per pound on the butterfat, protein, and other solids that were left?
That is an excellent question. So I'm laughing, Senator Starr, because brief side story. My wife is from Quebec, and I have a brother-in-law that has a maple, has a sugaring off place in not north of where you guys are sitting, just a couple of hours, and he has an RO right there, right in his when he's sugaring off, right, to take. I don't know, he takes 75% of the water off or 50% or something and then boils the rest, right?
Yeah.
And so I was actually just last spring in his looking at his place and I was wondering myself, hey, because what happens in general is that the co-ops or in general have the RO plants, and what they do is if they're going to ship milk, and that milk mostly ends up going into cheese, right? But if I'm going to haul milk from, I don't know, northern Vermont to a cheese plant in southern Pennsylvania, it's a lot cheaper if I take off half the milk. And so I kind of put that question to a couple people, and what they said was that they thought if you put an RO on the farm that you might end up getting regulated as a plant. And so they weren't exactly certain how that would work. But it is a fair question.
Well, the thing of it is, the farmer pays the hauling.
Right.
And I don't know what they're charged, but I would expect $4 a mile at least, you know, for trucking that. Well, if you could cut that in half to $2, that's $2 a hundredweight there that the farmer's gonna gain. Plus, then you got valuable product, more valuable product on that trailer that's going directly to a plant to separate out the solids, which would, I would expect, be mostly mechanical. So you wouldn't need a lot of laborers around doing it. So you're going to save money there. I don't know. That's something to think about.
Yeah, I had the exact same thought when I was in my brother-in-law's place, and I thought that's why I put that question. Now, with the hauling, though, one thing to keep in mind is that the individual farmer pays the hauling to the initial drop-off point, which and if it gets hauled further than usual, what generally happens with co-ops is that they only charge the farmer for where they normally drop the milk to, and the co-op splits the cost of sending it further. So like if I was in Vermont and normally my milk goes, 40 miles away, let's say, and they charge me and I end up paying 80 cents a hundredweight for that hauling. If today instead they said, guess what, we don't have capacity at that plant, so we're going to send your milk to, Maryland, then what would happen is that you would get charged the normal 80 cents and the co-op would split the difference of the rest, because you're right, in that case, you're going to pay, $3.50 a hundredweight or something like that to get it down there. And so, but I had the exact same question you did. And the answer that I got back, and we can dig more into it, was that they weren't certain because nobody was doing that, but they thought you might get regulated as a plant. So.
Chris, I have a different question. You talked about a difference between the Boston price and the Middlebury price, and it actually sounded somewhat significant. So I'm just curious, why is there a difference between the Boston price and the Middlebury price?
That's that class 1 differential with the pricing surface that I showed you earlier with all the different colors. So yep. That's just the defined, again, trying to make certain that milk has an incentive to flow towards the places that need the milk. And so that's this differential right here, which is 65-cent adjustment for Middlebury versus Boston. And for example, then you get down to like Buffalo's $1.05, and St. Albans is 85 cents. So it's higher there. And again, these are minimum prices, right? So if we're sitting at minimum all the time, this is very important. If we can get a premium out, it's maybe a little bit less important, but that reflects that surface. And that's the differential on the class 1 there.
Okay, thanks.
So, let me just real briefly talk about just an example of a hypothetical farm that's in Addison County, marketing 400,000 pounds of milk a month, which is roughly 200 average cows, which is in the neighborhood of the average size farm in Vermont, which is something like 193, 194 cows right at the current time. And the average milk production is 24,000 pounds a cow. So I'm just sticking in the average on that, right? So, and they're selling milk in July of 2022, that was 4% butterfat and 3.05% protein. So they're a little high on butterfat, but there's certainly plenty of herds that are doing this. The butterfat price was $3.36. They've got 16,000 pounds of that 400,000 pounds that's butterfat at 4%. So the value that there is about just shy of $54,000. They got 3.05% protein at $291 a pound, 12,200 pounds. They've got about $35,500 worth of protein that they sold that month. 5% other solids at 36 cents a pound. There's 22,800 pounds of other solids. So that's $8,200. The component value is $97,470, which would have been $24.36 at those minimum prices. The producer price differential and that location is $260 a hundredweight times the 4,000 a hundredweight is $10,400. So if we take the component value of 97,470 plus the 10,400, we've got $107,870 divided by the 4,000 hundredweight is 2697 a hundredweight as far as the federal order is concerned for that particular farm. But then we need to be concerned with, I'm just going to skip down here and I'll go back. Okay. But the farm milk price, and I've spent all this time talking about the federal milk marketing order prices, which we've gone through in great detail. But what the farmer actually gets paid then also depends on the cooperative, the state, and the regional market aspects, which is to say, what are the balancing issues? If I'm part of Agrimark and we don't have enough balancing capacity this month, or we have just more milk than we need, so we're sending a lot of milk a couple 100 miles away, and that milk is costing us an extra $4 a hundredweight to haul, then for that milk, we're probably going to spread that cost across everybody, and that's going to be a deduct. On the other hand, if I'm Agrimark and I'm getting a premium because my milk is going in to make high value cheddar cheese, then that's going to be a premium that comes back on my milk check. And there's state policy specifics, which we'll talk briefly about. And then there's farm specific that have to do with, there's individual farm cost of hauling to whatever the first drop off point is at least. There's quality aspects that we've talked about in terms of somatic cell count. And there might be, depending on where you're at, a volume premium or a drop off or a stop charge, depending on where you're marketing your milk and what the current situation is. So this kind of 2697 is going to be adjusted from that, right? Nobody except kind of by accident is going to get that 2697. And again, so we've got for July of 2022, we've got, depending on where you're at and what you're using the milk for. So Booth Brothers class 1 raw milk price to make beverage milk in July 2022 is going to be what, $29.12. Agrimark, on the other hand, is for class 4 price is going to, to make powder, you're going to be paying $25.79. So it depends on where it's going and what it's being used for. And the market administrator calculates the statistical uniform prices, and the co-ops then are going to make an estimated price to begin with, and then they're going to settle. So they may estimate that the price was going to be $27. It ends up being $27.89. So they need to send out a settlement check. And the market administrator audits this and makes certain that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. I've already talked about some of that, so I'm just going to move on because we are getting tight on time. So then let me just kind of finish up the milk marketing orders by talking about milk marketing orders can be modified. The market administrator has a certain amount of leeway on changes like qualifying standards that I talked about, maybe loosening them up because it was too hard for a co-op to get 10 or 15% of their milk in September and October into class 1 and things like that. But to make major changes, they have to go through administrative hearing process. And these take a significant amount of time generally, where somebody has to petition for the USDA to have a hearing and what the hearing should cover. The Secretary of Agriculture has to decide that they're going to have these hearings. These are formal legal processes where people are invited to testify and testify the different opinions, and the USDA has to consider the producers and the consumers. They have a mandate to do that. And so they generally take a significant amount of time, and people get frustrated sometimes by kind of how difficult it is to get through that whole process. Once the USDA goes through that process, they put, if they're going to make changes, they propose the modified hearing or modified order, excuse me. And then they put it out to the farmers to vote on it, and the vote is up or down. And it's not, so let's say, for example, that they decided to change the make allowances which means the amount that the processors get in credit out of the wholesale prices when we're calculating the component prices. The farmers then vote on that modified order, and they vote yes or no. You can't say, no, we want the old order. It's the modified language. And if you vote no, if you vote it down, then you no longer have an order. You can't pick and choose. We want this part, we don't want that part. That's not the way this process works for federal milk marketing orders. And the other thing is that block voting is allowed by co-ops, but not required. I think there's some misunderstanding that I've heard in some places recently about this. Whether a co-op like Dairy Farmers of America block votes, which means that they vote for everybody at once, is up to the co-op. They are allowed to, but not required to block vote. So obviously, if you have block voting and most of the milk goes through co-ops, then if the co-ops vote for that order, then it's going to pass. And if they vote against it, then it's likely to fail. And the co-ops could, in fact, decide, no, we're going to let everybody vote individually and we'll tally them up. And we'll say, okay, we have 2,000 members and 1,500 voted yes and 500 voted no. We're going to turn in those votes. That's not generally the way they do it. They could. And the people that are kind of agitating for doing away with block voting, for the most part, in my opinion, would like to see the orders go away. And that's why they want that. And that's fine. They're entitled to advocate for what they want.
I have a quick question on that.
Sure.
Who generally are the petitioners? Is it the producers or the consumers in the administrative hearings?
It's generally the co-ops or processors, or some combination of cooperatives and processors.
Okay, thanks.
But it's so yeah. It's funny. The consumers could.
No,
But
no,
but
sorry, you'd have to legally, there's actually a Supreme Court case, consumers don't have standing to petition.
okay.
For what we're hearing.
All right. In California, they did. So, all right. So thanks for clarifying that, Dan. So, overorder premiums, then let me talk a little bit about that, because that's kind of where you guys are headed, right? So when overorder premiums mean exactly what they sound like, which is an amount that the producers get paid above the minimum prices that were defined by the orders. And when you have these overorder premiums, the minimum prices that are defined by the federal milk marketing orders provide a base point for bargaining and reference. And so it's they work well together in the sense that you can define a price, say a target price, let's say $20, and say that the overorder premium is some difference between the target price and whatever the federal milk marketing order price comes in at. And if it's above $20, then we'll have no overorder premium. If it's below that, it'll be the difference. So if it was 18, it'd be $2. Or you can define the overorder premium as a certain amount and say, between $18 and $20, it'll be $2, and at $20, it'll be $1, and at $21, it'll be 50 cents. And so you see them kind of defined different ways depending on what they're used for. But that's what we're talking about. And you can have overorder premiums for any of the classes of milk. You could have an agreement that we're going to get class 3 milk into this place at some premium above the minimum that's defined. But generally, these have historically referred to class 1 markets in most cases. So the state policies can be a complement or a substitute for the federal milk marketing orders. So for example, Western New York operates essentially the same as the Northeast, but just covers the counties in Western New York. And let me just talk briefly, and we're running out of time, so I'm sorry. Maine has a milk commission that has authority to set the overorder premium and increase wholesale and retail prices. And then these premiums are passed on to farms proportionate to the class 1 utilization of Maine milk for that processor. And they use studies in this case to determine the margin at the producer, dealer, and retailer level at 3-year rotation, and they make farm payments based on size tiers, which is interesting. Because not everybody, that's kind of unique. So for example, if they announce an overorder premium of $1.04, which I think is about what the current one, and then if the class 1 utilization is 60%, then what that ends up meaning, that $1.04 ends up being about 60 cents at the farm level.
Chris, if I could just clarify, and we'll get into this a little bit more, the overorder price is that, and that's not paid on a tiered level. There's an additional subsidy program that's in addition to the overorder price, that is separate, completely separate, and in addition. So they don't tier this one.
Okay.
The price that's paid to the farmers in that example at 60 cents. So we'll get into that more with the commission, with the task force to clarify that.
Well, thanks for the clarification. So this is the tiers. So this is an additional program.
Correct. That's
Right?
correct.
And so depending on how much milk you sell.
Programs, right.
Right. And what's interesting about this, right, is you'll see that as you get more milk production, you get a lower target price. So you know, if you stay in tier 1, and everybody starts off in tier 1, right, Dan? And then as production increases, then the payments are based on the difference between the target and the blend price.
Okay. So just simply, if you get your federal order price plus the state over order price, and if that combination is less than the tier, then there's a payment made out of the general fund to get the producer up to that minimum target price, depending on your production. So right now, the federal order price, if it's whatever you showed before, $27, it's not paying anything under the tier program, but they're still getting the 60 cents on top of the federal order price, even though the federal order price is way above the tier price. So there's two completely separate programs in Maine.
And how often are the target prices changed?
The target prices were just changed this year for the first time, I believe, since the program was established close to 10 years ago. They're supposed to be established to be modified more often, but it just hasn't worked out that way. They've left them. It's up to the legislature to make the changes, and they've decided not to until literally this year.
Okay. Thanks.
Dan, I just have a couple sort of questions or thoughts. Thank you so much, Chris. It's just been a really great tour of a very complex set of questions. And I would love to, there's a bunch of that I'd love to dig in further on. A couple of things that come up, and just as suggestions maybe for consideration by the chairs, getting a chance to hear from Cabot Agrimark at some point in this and learn more about the co-op's perspective and just the business model would be, I think, very interesting, or some way in which we could get into that conversation. And then also, if there's a way to learn from what's happening in Maine and perhaps there's some of the other states that have a state pricing mechanism in place, I think that could be really interesting and beneficial for us. I'll leave it there.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Nick, we heard from the Maine folks in the last go round, and all of the testimony that's presented is on the website.
Great.
So we've had a fair amount. I can help you. I can send the testimony to you, because they went in quite a bit of detail in Maine. And for sure, we will be hearing from the co-ops, in part in response to Randy's point before. If we're going to do anything, we have to hear from the businesses that might be affected, and along the way, hear from them as to how their business models operate independent of a state program. So for sure, we need to hear from them. So Chris, do you want to, we're 5 minutes. Do you want to just complete and give us a little couple minutes to?
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Dan. Let me just briefly. So Pennsylvania is another state that, you know, is nearby, right? And has a milk marketing board that with the goals to enhance farmer revenue. And you know, they're setting, in this case, producer, wholesale, and retail prices that are minimums. So again, you can be above it, but not below it. And it establishes an overorder premium on milk that's produced, processed, and sold in Pennsylvania. So it has to be all three of those things. Okay, so if it's produced in Pennsylvania but leaves the state for processing or is ultimately sold at, outside of Pennsylvania, then it's not going to qualify on this. So this is very state specific. And so what it ends up being is about 15, but that should say milk, 15 to 20% of the milk that's produced in Pennsylvania ends up getting the overorder premium. And there are also wholesale and retail minimum prices that are set for, and they define 6 different marketing areas. And you can go on and look at the map. And they build that based on kind of an economic engineering cost, which is they take the class 1 farm price and add in processing, packaging, delivering, handling, and sales costs, and come up with what they define as a minimum retail price out of that. And so the intention is to be fair at the farm level, but also to make certain that they're keeping the processors and retailers having a fair return also. And so you can, for example, look at this, the overorder premium, July 2022 at the farm level is the kind of, middle one here, which is $1.72, but you take that on about 20% of the milk. So you've got about a fifth of that, right? So you end up being 35 cents is what it ends up being for the average Pennsylvania producer.
Small volume.
So it's really because it's confined to the milk that's produced, processed, and sold in Pennsylvania that that it's not a bigger amount there. And then finally, and I'll be brief here, California originally actually applied for a federal order back when we kind of started this whole process in the first kind of 1933 Act, and was denied a federal order because the federal judge ruled that they were too far outside, too far away from the other ones. And so at least that's kind of the short non-lawyer version of it. And so California said, forget it, we'll form our own state order. And then back in 1937, when they could have come back in and asked for a federal order, they said, no, we've already got our own order. We're just gonna do that. And as you know, California grew like gangbusters in the 80s and 90s and is the largest milk producing state. Currently, it produces about 18% of US milk production, although a few years back it was 20%, so it's a little less than it used to be. And California's order defined 5 classes of milk. So 1, 2, 3, 4A and 4B. So fluid, 1, 2. Well, 1 is similar to 1 is now. 2 and 3 were really what's called 2 in the federal orders now. And then 4A is what we would call 4, and 4B is what we would call 3 in federal orders. So they defined it a little bit differently. But California also was kind of the first to define the components, and they had component pricing early on. So in some ways, the federal milk marketing orders moved in some ways to be more like California over time. California derived their component prices from wholesale kind of and spot butter prices. So they did the Chicago Mercantile Exchange butter and block cheddar, and then used the California non-fat dry milk and Western dry whey price. And they surveyed their processing plants in California regularly to estimate what their manufacturing costs were, and adjusted it much more frequently, which is something that I think we might see coming to the federal milk marketing orders. But importantly, when California created this marketing order, they actually didn't do market-wide pooling. So they had classified prices, which set minimums. But if you had a class 1 contract, you got paid class 1. If you had a class 4B contract, you got paid class 4B, and they were different. Then they wanted to institute market-wide pooling in 1969. And in order to do that, what they did is give the class 1 guys quota, which entitled them to be paid off the top a higher amount. Okay. And that over time, the quota grew based on class 1 sales. So when there was more class 1 sales, there was more quota allocated to the people that had the class 1 sales. And quota could be sold and traded And when they instituted the federal order 2 years ago, they peeled off the quota, and it still operates as a California program. Although there's been people that have been trying to get rid of it, so maybe they will. So, and the important thing about California is that here you have, in kind of contrast to the like Maine program, California, most of California's milk is leaving the state, right? So they had this state program that was administered to the milk that was produced and processed in the state of California, but most of the products then were leaving to be sold elsewhere. And
Chris,
then,
do you know how much of the percentage wise, how much of California's milk products leave the state, ballpark?
at the current time, I do not. The majority.
At least the majority?
Oh yeah,
Would you say 70%?
it might be. I'm sorry, I don't have that off the top of my head. That's a number that I should know, but I don't off the top of my head at the current time.
Is it possible to find that out?
Yes.
Okay, can you follow up and let us know?
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yes, and so then, whoops. So I think the challenges with these state policies are that you need to understand what what they're going to do to farm cooperative and processor incentives of behavior, right? That's kind of the key, or a key, I would, from an economics point of view. So sorry about running a little long there, guys.
Well, thank you very much. That's a lot of information to assimilate, and I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions and look forward to continuing the discussion. We're a little past noon. Do any members have any final questions for Chris? John?
Thanks, Dan. I mean, just in the big picture here, it's funny what Chris has been saying. It makes me think, we know our dairy farmers personally and the economics they have to deal with. And then we see this sort of global or international scale and these huge, processors or manufacturers. And I'm thinking, what you were saying, Chris, about the federal orders is, if I'm Walmart or Kroger, I'm thinking, what would happen if we put a 30,000 cow dairy, near Miami with climate controlled, and we'll get our calories from Brazil. It just seems like it's this big sort of, money game that you're playing. And there's such a disconnect in that world from what we see, just down the road at our 200 cow dairies in Vermont, and just how to reconcile that is really difficult.
Yeah, no, I think that's consolidation, especially in animal agriculture in this country, as a lot of consolidation has taken place in the last few decades, to the point where, if you're thinking poultry or pork, it's very, very vertically integrated, right? Beef is integrated at the feedlot and processor level, not at the cow calf level. And there's reasons for that, which is to say that it still makes sense to have your cow calf operation on pastures, which are, spread out by landowners and not as easy to consolidate. One of the things that has been true of dairy is that while it has consolidated, it's consolidated much less than some of those other factors. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact the amount of management that's required at the cow level, which varies. It's much easier to say, if I'm Smithfield, I'm going to own the pigs, but I'll let you raise them. But here's the pigs, and here's what you feed them every day, and here's when you give them their injections, and here's when they go to market. That doesn't work as well for a dairy cow that has a forage-based diet, where you have to watch for rumen acidosis and other things like that, and you're going to change the diet based on specific conditions, right? Which doesn't mean you can't grow. It just hasn't grown as much. But I think, part of what you want to get at, in particular, if you're going to be a small or medium-sized operation today, is that you want to market to people that appreciate that and that are willing to pay a little bit for that, for the amenity value, for the other things that go with that, right? And there are people that will do that. And so the important thing is to, get that. And there are, there are lots of examples of that happening, particularly in the Northeast. It's just taking advantage of that is important.
Other questions from people virtually? If not, Senator Starr, your concluding
Well,
thoughts for us?
no, I just want to thank Chris for all this great information. And, I beat around this dairy pricing stuff for years, and you laid it out very, very well. But it is complicated. And for our members on the task force, I make sure, I'm going to make sure Linda either sends Chris's presentation to you all electronically, so you'll have it on file to review as we move forward. But I want to thank Chris for all that wonderful presentation, and I'm sure there's some parts of that that are going to be very important to us as we move forward, thinking about how we deal with this pricing volatility that many of our farmers have gone through over the last few years. So thanks again, Chris.
So I would just say, following up on what Bobby said, hopefully Chris, we all would expect, if you, having reviewed your testimony, to have some follow-up questions. And if members of the task force have questions, I hope it's okay if they follow up with you, and we can, maybe even think about bringing you back for some follow-up as we go forward.
Thank you. I'd be happy to, continue this conversation. I appreciate you having me this morning and asking such good questions.
Thank you very much. And with that,